You may think you've broken free. You've done the shadow work, faced the pain, left the chains behind. And yet there is one illusion that remains. Carl Jung warned that the ego's final trick is to disguise itself as the self. To whisper, "I am enlightened. I am whole. I am above it now." This is the most dangerous illusion because it feels like truth. It looks like awakening. But in reality, it is just another mask. Another way the ego avoids surrender. In this video, we'll explore the ego's final illusion, why Jung saw it as the greatest danger on the spiritual path, and how real individuation is never about inflation. It is about humility, integration, and the return to the self. Stay with me, because the end of illusion is the beginning of true freedom. The experience. The subtle illusion of I am free. There comes a point on many people's journey where they believe they've finally escaped the grip of the ego. They've left toxic relationships, set boundaries, faced their shadows, built new practices of healing. And for a while, life feels lighter. The old chains no longer bind. The pain that once haunted them feels distant. They begin to think, "I've made it. I've transcended the struggle." But here is the subtle danger: this sense of freedom itself can become another mask. Maybe you've felt it, the quiet pride of believing you are above the chaos others still struggle with. The temptation to think, "I've done the work, I've arrived. I'm beyond those illusions now." On the surface, it feels like growth, but deep down, it's a trap. The ego reinventing itself, slipping into spiritual clothing, whispering, "I am the self." This illusion can be intoxicating. You meditate, you journal, you quote wisdom, you practice rituals, and slowly the identity of being awakened becomes another persona. Instead of performing for success or approval, you now perform for enlightenment. You seek to prove not to others, but to yourself that you've transcended. And in doing so, you fall back into the very cycle you thought you left behind. It's a subtle arrogance that hides in spiritual progress. You start to compare. They are still trapped, but I see clearly. You deny your lingering wounds, dismiss your raw emotions, suppress your human messiness, because those don't fit the identity of someone who is free. And yet all the while, your shadow waits unacknowledged, growing restless. Many people mistake this stage for individuation, when in truth it is another detour. Jung warned that the ego is cunning. Just when you think you've unmasked it, it finds a new disguise. And perhaps its most dangerous disguise is this, the belief that you no longer have one. The cost of this illusion is subtle, but profound. You begin to live once again in performance, this time, not for society's applause, but for your own sense of spiritual superiority. You silence your doubts, shame your setbacks, and hide from your shadow with a smile of, "I'm fine. I've evolved." On the outside, you may look enlightened. On the inside, you know something is still missing, and so you find yourself restless again. Despite all your healing, the emptiness lingers. Despite all your progress, the wholeness you longed for still feels out of reach. And if you're honest, you can sense the truth: you haven't left the ego behind. You've only stepped into its final illusion. Jung. The ego's final illusion. Carl Jung observed that the ego does not surrender easily. Even after you've peeled away layer after layer of masks, faced your shadow, and walked through pain, the ego still has one more trick. It takes the language of the self and makes it its own. It whispers, "I am whole. I am enlightened. I am above it now." This is what Jung called ego inflation. The ego swelling with the illusion that it has become the self. Instead of serving as a bridge between the conscious and unconscious, the ego tries to crown itself king. It begins to believe it is the totality rather than a part of it. And this is dangerous because it shuts the door to further growth. Inflation often shows up subtly. You may believe your insights make you superior to others. You may dismiss your raw emotions as low vibration, pretending you've transcended anger, envy, or grief. You may cling to spiritual practices not as tools of connection, but as badges of identity. Jung warned that this is not individuation, it is spiritual bypassing. Instead of integrating the shadow, the ego uses spirituality to avoid it. The tragedy is that this illusion feels so convincing. The peace of routines, the pride of progress, the comfort of belonging to an awakened identity, all of it masquerades as wholeness. But Jung insisted the self is never reached by denying humanity. It is reached by embracing it. To believe you are done is to prove you are not. Jung compared the self to a mandala, an endless circle of integration always unfolding. No matter how far you've come, there is always more to embrace. New shadows, new paradoxes, new contradictions to hold. Inflation occurs when the ego says, "I've reached the center." There's nothing left to do. Individuation, by contrast, is the humility to keep walking, knowing the path is lifelong. Spiritual bypassing is perhaps the clearest symptom of the ego's final illusion. Instead of dealing with anger, people chant affirmations. Instead of grieving, they repeat. Everything happens for a reason. Instead of confronting the messy truth of their humanity, they hide behind the polished mask of being healed. But the unconscious cannot be fooled. The shadow remains waiting. And when it is ignored long enough, it will erupt again sometimes, even more violently than before. Jung's warning is sharp. The self cannot be possessed by the ego. The moment the ego says, "I am the self," the connection is broken. True individuation requires the opposite movement, the ego bowing to the self, acknowledging it is not the master, but the servant of a larger wholeness. This is why Jung insisted humility is the hallmark of true growth. The more authentic the awakening, the less you feel superior. The more real the integration, the more willing you are to admit your limitations. The closer you come to the self, the less you need to announce it. The ego's final illusion is seductive because it flatters. It makes you feel powerful, special, enlightened. But Jung would say that the real sign of progress is not inflation, but integration. Not denial of your humanity, but the embrace of it. The consequences, false awakening, and the loss of the self. The most dangerous trap on the inner journey is not ignorance. It is the illusion of enlightenment. Jung warned that when the ego inflates and disguises itself as the self, the seeker does not just stall, they regress. Because instead of living in truth, they live in performance. Instead of humility, they fall into subtle arrogance. And the cost is a profound disconnection from the very wholeness they seek. The first consequence is false awakening. When the ego convinces you that you've arrived, your growth stops. You believe there is nothing left to face, nothing left to integrate. The shadow is still alive, but you can no longer see it because you've buried it under the label of "I am whole." This is the cruel irony of inflation. You feel awake, but you are still asleep, dreaming inside the persona of spirituality. The second consequence is loss of humility. Jung insisted that individuation requires a posture of humility before the self. To recognize that you are not the master of your psyche, but a participant in its unfolding. When the ego claims the self, humility dies. You begin to compare, to judge, to feel superior to those who are less awakened. But superiority is not the fruit of individuation, it is its opposite. The moment you look down on others, you have left the path of wholeness. The third consequence is disconnection from the real self. Because the self cannot be possessed. It cannot be claimed as an identity. It can only be served. When the ego inflates, the true self recedes from awareness. What remains is a hollow performance rituals, without depth wisdom, without embodiment, words without soul. You speak of wholeness, but you do not feel it. You talk about light, but you secretly fear your own darkness. The fourth consequence is spiritual bypassing that corrodes the soul. When you deny pain in the name of positivity, you rob yourself of transformation. When you dismiss grief rage or fear as low vibration, you leave the shadow unintegrated. Over time, this creates a split inside a polished surface masking a restless, aching depth. And eventually, the mask cracks sometimes in public collapse, sometimes in private despair. Perhaps the most tragic consequence is the loss of authenticity, because deep down you know. You sense the emptiness behind your performance. You feel the hollowness in repeating mantras you no longer believe. You carry the quiet fear that maybe you are not as free as you tell yourself. This inner dissonance corrodes trust in yourself. And without that trust, the bridge to the self crumbles. Jung would say this is the ultimate danger of ego inflation. It doesn't just keep you from the self, it convinces you that you are already there. And in that illusion, you lose the very essence of the journey. Humility, openness, and the willingness to be undone. The false awakening may look impressive from the outside, but inside, it leaves the soul more isolated than ever trapped, not in ignorance, but in illusion. And illusion is the hardest prison to leave, because you don't even know you are locked inside. Transformation when the ego bows to the self. If the ego's final illusion is to claim, I am the self, then true individuation begins with its surrender. Jung taught that the self is not an achievement, not a status to be claimed, but a mystery to be lived. To individuate is not to inflate the ego, but to place it in service of something greater. It is to allow the ego to bow to admit it is not the center, but a servant of the whole psyche. The first step is humility. Individuation requires the courage to admit, I am not finished. I am not above my humanity. I am not immune to shadow. True freedom is not the denial of your wounds, but the willingness to carry them with grace. Humility dissolves the illusion of superiority and opens the door to authentic growth. The second step is integration. Instead of bypassing emotions, you meet them. Instead of shaming your darkness, you embrace it as part of the whole. Jung said, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Real individuation is messy. It is tears and rage, laughter and silence, fear and courage, all held in one container. Integration is not purity. It is wholeness. The third step is relationship with the self. The self is not an identity to wear, but a center to align with. It speaks through dreams, symbols, synchronicities, and the quiet voice of intuition. To live from the self is to listen more than to declare. To surrender more than to control. It is to trust that the wholeness of your being is wiser than the plans of your ego. The fourth step is paradox. Jung insisted that individuation is not about erasing contradictions, but holding them. To be strong and vulnerable, to be light and shadow, to be finite and connected to something infinite. The ego seeks certainty, but the self thrives in paradox. When you embrace this tension, you discover a deeper freedom, the freedom to be fully human. And finally, individuation is lifelong. There is no final arrival, no ultimate claim of "I am enlightened." The moment you think you've reached the end is the moment the ego has tricked you again. Individuation is a path you walk for as long as you live, unfolding layer by layer. Each step is both humbling and liberating. This is the true transformation Jung envisioned. Not the ego crowning itself as the self, but the ego bowing, serving listening. Not bypassing pain, but integrating it. Not seeking perfection, but embracing wholeness. And in this surrender, something shifts. You no longer need to prove you are awakened. You no longer need to cling to illusions of superiority. You no longer fear your shadow. You live simply authentically, aligned with the self. And that, Jung would say, is real freedom. The freedom not to escape your humanity, but to embody it fully. The ego's final illusion ends the moment you bow. And in that bow, you return home to yourself. The ego's final illusion is seductive, to believe I am the self. I am complete. I am above it all. But Jung would remind us this is not awakening. It is inflation. True individuation begins not with superiority, but with surrender. Not with claiming the self, but with bowing to it. Across this series, we've walked through the traps of the empath, the hunger for healing, the ache of loneliness, the lies of the ego, the weight of the collective shadow, the danger of comfort possession by the unconscious, and now the illusion of false awakening. All of it leads to one truth. Freedom is not the escape from your humanity. It is the embrace of it. So if you felt exposed, shaken, even humbled through this journey, know this: that is the beginning of real growth. The self is not far away. It has been with you all along, waiting for the ego to bow, waiting for you. What a return. If these videos have spoken to you, share them with those who are also searching for depth and wholeness. And if you want to continue exploring Jung's wisdom with us, subscribe and stay close. Because the journey does not end here. Each step into shadow, into paradox, into truth, is one step closer to becoming fully authentically alive.